So today is lesson 10, and we're going to sort of focus the rest of our class on the A in our mean stack, on Angular. So today we're going to just kind of work exclusively with Angular, and then next week we'll start folding it into a Node application where we're using Node and Express on the back end or the server end, and then we'll build a sort of a separate integrated client end using Angular. Anybody worked with Angular at all before? Do you know anything about it? Not yet. All right, my assumption is that it's new. Angular's neat. It does some cool things for us. It's very powerful. It's quite big, and there's a lot to know. So we're not doing a deep dive into it. We're just going to do it briefly. By way of introduction, before we start playing around with it, we've got two short videos here. They're actually available on the LinkedIn Learning site. So I'll put the link in the chat for you as well. You will need to log in with your college credentials. So what I'm going to do, rather than play videos within my recording, I'm just going to pause the recording here for a minute. So go and watch those two videos. I think it's a total of 3 minutes. And just give me like a thumbs up when you are done watching those videos. So it's the intro from the LinkedIn Learning Intro to Angular course. So I will pause my recording. So we've had a look at the LinkedIn Learning kind of intro videos. Again, I'm recommending this is an excellent resource to go through the rest of the LinkedIn Learning course. Take you a few hours to go through and really kind of be a nice complement to what we're going to do in class. I'm going to give you my own little overview, kind of picking up on some of the concepts mentioned in the video and fleshing them out a bit more. So these slides are here for you to reference. I know it's week 10, it says lesson 11, so just ignore that. We'll do a bit of an overview and then we'll start playing around with this stuff. So Angular is actually a Google product, and it was created to make dynamic UIs. Probably the most common usage is in what are known as SPAs, so single page applications. And in those, we can do everything and our page never reloads. So obviously this is not for a complex app, for something fairly simple. One of the cool things is Angular shows our data in real time. So our page never needs to actually be refreshed or be reloaded by the user. It's used both on web and mobile, where we can have a single code base. An important thing to note about Angular compared to some of the sort of competing JavaScript products is that it is what's called opinionated. So opinionated meaning it has a very particular way of structuring and naming things. So much like the .NET framework, it will automate a lot of things for us, but we have to follow the rules and conventions in terms of how we structure our app and build it. Okay, so Angular is much more opinionated than some other JavaScript libraries, such as, for example, React. So where does Angular fit into our stack? Right? We've done most of this. We've got our client. We've built our MongoDB backend. We've used Node as our middleware, and then Express for making, and Mongoose for making those requests. In our front end here, we have so far used handlebars. We've used HBS templating. So what we're going to do is we're going to eventually rebuild our Node Tunes app, but we're going to rewrite the front end so that it uses Angular. So we have this dynamic single page front end that can interact, and then our Express backend, instead of returning or rendering views, it's simply our backend just becomes an API. All our Express controller does is send and receive Json between Express and our Angular front end. A couple things to note. You may sometimes see tutorials or resources that refer to the term AngularJS. This is Angular 1. Anything that says AngularJS is really deprecated. It's very old. They've renamed it in version 2 to Angular, and versions 1 and 2 are not interoperable, not at all. I think we're now on version 13. So that will just be the new version of Angular. But anything that says AngularJS is version 1, and it's old. If you see some tutorial and some resource that says AngularJS, you don't want to use it. So here's kind of the magic of Angular. It boils down to this two-way data binding. So what two-way data binding does is it makes sure the data that's in our UI, that's displayed in our application, is always in sync with the underlying data model. So for example, if we're looking at a page and that page displays a list of data, if someone else adds a new record into the database, our list can automatically be updated with no intervention on the user part. So we have some sort of template, and this two-way binding makes sure, and we'll actually see this in action, we're going to implement this today, that if the view changes, it changes the underlying data set, and if the data set changes, it updates the view continuously. So we get real-time data. We can do create, read, update, and delete, have our page and our data modify without having to reload our page at all. And it uses some of these. The primary element that it uses are called components. So an Angular component, it's much like a class object, really. And Angular is component-based. So for example, in our node tunes, if we were going to rebuild that using Angular, we'll probably have a artist component with the properties that define an artist. We might have an album component that would be separate. And then we also will have these services. And the services are kind of those interfaces between our Angular application and our Node and Express backend. So when we're done, we're going to have some more layers to the application. So right now we basically have in our application right now, we've really got, what have we got? 4 layers. We've got MongoDB on the back end. We have Express and Node, and then we have HBS templates on the front end. So this Angular is not one layer, it's actually going to be several layers. One of the other important elements to know about Angular is that our code is written in a superset of JavaScript called Typescript. Has anybody worked with Typescript before or heard of it? Know anything about Typescript? Okay, Booger, you tried it once? Nope, it's new. I expect Typescript would be new for most people. So Typescript is designed, okay, thanks, Simon. It's designed to make up for JavaScript's great failing. Right, so the JavaScript has become more and more popular, but the one big failing of JavaScript is that it's loosely typed. In JavaScript, we can declare a variable with let, and then, but we don't specify any particular type. Let me just go here, right? So I can do something like this. Just play around for a minute. Yeah, exactly. Here, let me just go to the console, right? So I can say let, x equals 1, 2, 3. Sorry. Right, so it will allow me to do this. It'll allow me to give it a numeric value and then change that to a string value, or yes, as Chris says, right, it'll let us do something like console.log. Right, so it has typing, but it's really sort of loose, and we can change it. So this is a big failing of JavaScript. And it's one of the reasons why JavaScript was not used for server-side programming for a long time. So TypeScript was a modification to JavaScript that allowed us to write a strongly typed version of JavaScript instead. It also supports object-oriented features. So the idea when we write our code, so all our Angular code, so we actually write in TypeScript. So our files have .ts extensions, so we can write strongly typed JavaScript code, and then Angular has what's called a transpiler. It will convert all the TypeScript code to plain JavaScript. So at runtime, it's still plain JavaScript. But when we're coding, we're using TypeScript instead. So every time we create a .ts file, Angular will automatically make a matching JS file with the same name. And one of the other things that TypeScript does, not only does it enforce data type checking, but it also catches errors at compile time. So our application won't compile if it has syntax errors. When we write our node code, for example, we can run it, and it's only when we try to launch the application that it'll crash. Whereas TypeScript will actually give us compile errors, as Chris said, much like Java or C# would. And so we're not relying on the browser so much for debugging and error handling. So our main application logic, we write it in TypeScript. Angular also gives us a structure to the project, but most of the work we're doing is TypeScript. And one of the benefits of us spending a few classes with Angular is, TypeScript, then it's another tool that you get put in your toolbox. It's something you can put on your resume. You're going to see a lot of web development jobs and mobile development jobs that ask for TypeScript. So I don't think it's something we need a full course on, but it's something that I think all of you should have some exposure to before you graduate. There's a little reference here. We can take a quick look at it as well. So this is like a TypeScript quick start for JavaScript programmers. So TypeScript offers all of JavaScript features, but it has this additional layer on top, which is the typing. So for example, in JavaScript, we do this, and JavaScript just kind of assumes that it's a string. But we can explicitly create strongly typed objects in TypeScript. Right? So we've got here a name, so kind of like our Mongoose models, where we're explicitly using data types for each property. And so this is just a useful little reference. Again, this link is in the it's in the slides for you. So editors like WebStorm and Visual Studio Code, they both have a built-in TypeScript transpiler. So if we build .ts files, it will automatically do the transpilation, that conversion, and generate the JS files out of it. All right, let's jump over to the main Angular site, which is angular.io. Let's throw the link in the chat. Probably be a couple things here we're going to want. So I'll click on the Get Started link right here in the middle. So using Angular and TypeScript is kind of this interesting partnership because Angular was a Google product, TypeScript was a Microsoft product. But they've sort of worked together so that all Angular code, yes, you are not mistaken, Google. That's absolutely right. So Google developed, and the documentation, this actually looks like Google Docs, right? Like Google Help file. No, it's good you're ahead of me. That's great. But they're using TypeScript, which is a Microsoft product. Again, the original version of Angular didn't use TypeScript. That was added in version 2. And that's why version 1 and version 2+, they're not interoperable. Because in version 1, Angular just had its own kind of JavaScript version. And then they introduced TypeScript in version 2. So prerequisites, well, we know what HTML and JavaScript are. We've talked a little bit about TypeScript already. Okay, we'll skip that part. Let's go down here and click on Setup. Right, this is what we want. So we want to install, using NPM, we want to install the Angular CLI, the Angular command line interface. And there's a whole pile of NPM packages for Angular. They all start with the @ symbol, @Angular. So we're going to make a new project for today, but in order to do that, we first need to install globally the Angular CLI or command line interface. So open up your code editor, or you can just open up your terminal. We're going to go to the terminal first, but I'll just use my integrated terminal here. Oops, sorry, I'll just go back. We can do this. Sorry, we'll open up Node Tunes for now. That's fine. And open up your terminal, your command prompt. So right now, when you open it up, you are probably inside your Node Tunes folder. We're not going to work with this project anymore. So I don't want to work inside of Node Tunes. So I'm going to run the command cd ... to just go back to my main kind of root folder of all of my WebStorm projects. So get out, do cd ... to transverse one folder up, get out of your Node Tunes folder. Then we can copy the command. I'll put it in the chat as well, right? npm install or I -g @angular-CLI. So we only have to do this once. So the Angular CLI, it's kind of like the Express generator. It's going to scaffold a new Angular app for us. Well, that's what this tool that we're installing will allow us to build multiple apps, multiple Angular apps. So let's run that command. Okay, so it's installed the CLI version 13.0.2. And then our next instruction is you can develop apps in an Angular workspace. To create a new workspace and initial starter app, run this command, ng new, and then give it a name. So all of the Angular has its own set of command line commands, and they will all start with ng. So I'm going to make a new project. I'll do ng new. What do we want to call this? What's today? I'll just call it maybe Angular L10 or lesson 10. So no spaces in the project name. So this will work much like the Express generator, except instead of creating an Express project, it's going to create an Angular project. It's going to scaffold a whole pile of stuff in here. So ng new Angular L10. Okay, so I'll hit enter. And I will let the command line interface, would you like to use Angular routing? We don't really need this for today, but I'll just say yes to this. So I'll hit Y, doesn't really matter. Which style sheet format would you like to use? So by default, just uses regular CSS. Or we can use the arrow keys to select Sass or less or SCSS. I'll just hit enter here to accept the default selection, which is just regular cascading style sheets. So now it's creating an Angular 10 folder with a whole bunch of files. Okay, you may need to reinstall Node. Your Node version may be too old. If you want to check, you can run the command node -v. So I'm on node 14.17.6. So Mila, you may have to go over to Node. I'm not sure if you can just do an in-place update or if you just download and install the latest version. So I've created this project. I'm going to open it up now in my code editor. I'll click File, Open. And now here's my Angular Lesson 10 project. I'm going to open that up. So here's our scaffold. So we've got a bunch of JSON files. So some of these are familiar. We've got package.json, for example. It includes a whole bunch of dependencies for Angular, things like animation, the core, the forms module, routing, platform browser. We've got our Typescript configuration. We may actually have to modify a couple things in here later. I think we will want to. We've got a README file, auto-generated. And it actually tells us if we run the command ng-serve, this will run a development server at localhost 4200. The Angular development server includes a feature, much like NodeMon, it automatically reloads. So we don't need NodeMon when we're working with Angular. It uses a tool called Webpack, which bundles things, and Webpack will also help watch for changes. So we've got in here a few things. We've got this node modules. We've got a source folder. And in here, this is where most things actually live. We've got an index.html. We've got a bunch of TypeScript files. We've got a default style sheet, favicon, a place for static assets. And then our actual code lives in here. We've got one Angular component, which we'll look at. If I go and look at this folder, I'll just right-click my Angular 10 and choose open in Windows Explorer for a moment. It's quite big, 300 megs. Now, this is because we can compile it for production. It will be smaller. And if I go and look, of that 300 megs, almost the entire thing is dependencies. So the node modules is like 95% of the size. But it also gives us a git ignore. So if we push this stuff up to git, it will not include those 300 megabytes worth of node modules. So let's try and run the project now. We've got this ng-serve command. So make sure you're inside now. You may have to change directories, do cd Angular L10 so you're inside. And now I'll run ng-serve. This is going to compile the site. And we should be able to run it at localhost 4200. It says our server is listening, and it gives us a link. We can just click. So a little fuller what we get from the scaffolding app than what we got from the Express generator, right? The Express generator gives a little white screen that says, welcome to Express. There's a lot more stuff here. You'll notice the name of our project shows up here in the page title. It also shows up here in this little heading. And then it's got a bunch of kind of instructions here of what we could do. So we're going to use this later. It's got a series of different Angular commands. Later on, we're going to build our own component. You know, if we want to add the material design library, so this is Google's sort of style sheet and design patterns, we could add that. It's set up for running unit tests. We could compile production, a bunch of stuff here. So here's, for example, the material library, material design components. So it kind of looks like it follows Google's design patterns. It's got a lot of the colors and widgets and things like this. We'll maybe add this, play around with this later or in the next few weeks. Instead of using Bootstrap, we can use material design and get some exposure to some of these things. So let's make a change here. Let's go and look at what's here. Minimize my terminal. Close these files up. So I'm going to go inside of my source folder. First of all, I've got this index.html. So let's open that file up. Here's what we get. We've got our page title up at the top. So I'm going to change this page title. Just a second. Move this around so I can see both for a minute. So if I change my title on line 5, I'm going to change it to Angular Lesson 10. As soon as I hit Control S in my code editor, the page should update in my browser. So I'll hit Control S. Sorry, as soon as I come back to my browser, okay, didn't quite expect that. Now it's compiled again. Okay, I'm surprised. I thought it would get an auto update there. Maybe not when I change the HTML. Okay, that's all right. If I refresh it, yeah, now it does it. Okay, but I was just changing HTML. So most of this, sorry, we'll come back to that. Fail number 1. Now this looks pretty much like a standard HTML page, except for one thing. What is kind of new or unusual on this page that maybe you haven't seen before? Sorry, I missed the... No, you don't have to add Angular routing. Yes, Boogra, thank you. Right, you can also add the -- open. That not only starts the server, but it will open it in the browser. So yes, this app root is new. Mila, yeah, try to update your NPM, as Simon suggested. As well. That's very odd if that's your version. You may have to look at it after. So here's our app root. Boogra, close. It's related to Angular's component-based model. Okay, you had to, okay, so reinstall Node. It worked for you, Jason? Okay. So we don't actually see, like there's all this HTML here, but we don't see any of it. So what is this app root? obviously all of this content's got to live in here somewhere. So where is it? So inside of our app folder, first we're going to look at this app.module.typescript. This is kind of like our startup file. It's our main kind of configuration of our Angular application. So we have a few dependencies here. Now, Angular uses the import keyword. It doesn't use require like Node does. So we've got the Angular core module. We've got the browser platform, meaning our app is running in browser. So the front end is HTML. We've got the routing because we chose it at setup. We're not really using it. And then we're importing this app component. So we'll take a closer look. The app component is key. So we're declaring it here. And we've also got this bootstrap, meaning what is the startup component? Well, it's pointing to this file called app component, which we see here. So we'll go and look at that app.component at that TypeScript file. So again, we're referencing the Angular core. We're defining a component, and here is the selector. So the selector, this is like a custom HTML tag. So when we add this tag anywhere, we're basically injecting an instance of this Angular component. Now, you'll notice a couple other things. So we define the selector. So what HTML tag represents the component? It's also got a template and style URL. So the template URL, this contains all of the front end presentation of this component. So like if I view the source here, right, we don't see the HTML, we just see the app root. So the app root kind of hides, it obscures all of the HTML. That HTML doesn't get viewed in the page source, in the browser. But it gives us both an HTML file and a CSS file with the same name. So here's the HTML file, and it's got all of the content. And it's got all, for some bizarre reason, the template, and it says, this content is a placeholder only, delete the template and get started. It actually starts with 300 lines of CSS. Why they put it in here, I will never understand. It goes all the way down to 303. They gave us a style sheet. Those styles should probably be defined in here instead. And then all our HTML is here. Get the Angular logo, some divs, some headings, link to Angular on YouTube, The line I'm interested in is line 344. So this should look kind of familiar. Yeah. What's the familiar part? So it's all HTML except for here. So we get this. Yeah, exactly. We get handlebar syntax. So this span says app is running. So it's taking a variable from the Angular component and rendering it in handlebar syntax, right? So we can pass values from the component to the view, much like in Express, we passed values from our controller to our view. So where is this title property defined? Well, right here. So inside of our class called app component, we're exporting it, we're making it public, and we're defining a property called title. So then we can render that variable in handlebars. So let's try changing this. Let's say our first Angular app. So I'm going to save the changes, hit Control S, and now notice my app restarts. As soon as I change something, in the Typescript, my app recompiles and refreshes with no intervention in the browser. What would happen if I changed my property here to be a capital T? So if I change that, if I save the changes, I guess there's three things that could happen when I hit save. Either the page will reload and it will still show our first Angular app. That's option one. Option two is we get an error. Option three is it's just going to be blank. What do you think? So Booger thinks we'll get an error. Any other predictions? Will it work? Will we get an error? Will we get a blank screen? Adam thinks error as well. Chris thinks error. Okay, well, I'll try it. Probably Control S. Right? And now we can see property title in lowercase doesn't exist in our component. And now it's saying, well, there's a title with a capital T. Did you mean that instead? So it's actually suggesting a fix here. Okay? So those properties of the component, they're going to be case sensitive. So I undo that and save, and it's back up and running. So this app component, if we wanted to, we could wipe out everything that's here in the HTML if we wanted to. But what we want to do instead is we're going to generate our own component. So it tells us in this next step, so what do you want to do? Do you want, if you want to make a new component, you just click this and it gives us the command. So we can create the components manually, but much better to use the CLI, the command line interface. So if we run ng generate component, and then we give our component a name, what this will do is inside of our app folder, it will build a subfolder, and it's going to give us all of these files. It's going to give us 4 files. The component itself in TypeScript, the spec.ts, which that's just kind of the mapping file. We don't touch this one. This basically converts, right? It converts the TypeScript into JavaScript, so we just leave this alone. And then it will also give us an HTML and CSS file with the same name. And we'll use the HTML file to define the output of what happens with that component. So we're going to try this. So I'm going to go to my terminal, and I will just hit Control-C to stop the app temporarily so that we can run our ng generate component command. Now we want to generate it. If I do it here, it's going to put my component like right in the root of the project. So the component should be created in here, inside of src and app. I'm going to, at my terminal, I'm in my root folder. We'll do cd src /app. So now I'm inside my app subfolder. Now I'm going to run the component ng generate component. Let's generate an artist component. So we'll kind of rebuild. We'll use the artists that we've already got in our node tunes. We want to generate a component for this. And now it generates inside of our app folder. We've now got an artist subfolder with our component file. Here's my artist component. So the component's empty. Right? It imports the Angular core. Our selector will be app-artist. Again, it gives us an HTML and CSS file. And then we've got a class, a public class, it's exported. We've got a constructor here. So the constructor will be used if this component requires any dependencies. If you think back to our .NET class, when we created our MVC controllers, they always took a dependency of a DB context. So we get a default constructor here in case we need any dependencies. And then we have an ng on init method for any startup code. So anything, any code we want to run whenever this component gets invoked. We're probably not going to work with these today, but we should know what they are and we'll work with them next week. Okay, we'll take a break in a minute. We're just going to do one very simple thing. Let's just open up the artist component.html. And notice by default, it just gives us a little paragraph. It takes the name of the component and it says works. Cool. I'm going to go back up to my root folder, cd ... and cd ... So I'm going to go back to the root of the project. I'm going to start the server again. We want to recompile it, start it again. I can just use ng serve. So it's going to recompile. Go back to the browser. Nothing changes. Right? So what would we need to do? We actually need to do a few things. What if we want our site to show our artist component now instead of this app component? We don't want to see all this stuff. We just want to see a message that says artist works. Yeah, we need to change the routing. Yes. We'll have to change it in two places. Which two files do you think we should look at to change that startup component? So when we load the server, all we want is a message in the browser that says artist works. We need to make a change here. What should we change here? If we want to show the artist component. Yeah, we're going to change, instead of the app root tag, which selector do we need? That's right, Reden. We're going to change the app root to be app artist. Okay, I'm going to save that change. Now we got nothing. We've only done part of the job. So we do want to change this app root tag to app artist, but we have to do one more thing. And then we're going to do that, get it to work, and then we'll take a break. We need to open up under the app folder, we need to open up the app.module.ts. So this is our kind of main configuration file. Now it's added a reference here to the artist component. So when we run that ng generate component, a reference gets included here automatically. We didn't add line 6, this was generated for us. And it was also added to the list of declarations on line 11. We need to make one change to this file. Right now, our file is using, as the bootstrap, it's still rendering the app component as our bootstrap component. So I'm going to change line 18 to use the artist component instead. So this is our bootstrap or our startup component. And that's in app.module.ts, so I'm changing line 18. And now it shows our artist component here instead. So all of the components in the application will be declared, will be imported and declared, but only one of them can be the bootstrap. Actually, sorry, I shouldn't say only one of them, but the one we want to be displayed should be here. We might have multiple components. We would then comma separate them. It is an array if we wanted to display both components. So we could even try that. What if I put in an app component? If I do this, we should see artist works at the top and then everything else, I think, below. See what, I'm going to undo this. We're just going to try it. If I wanted to render multiple components, I think my artist works is here. Yeah, it's here. It's kind of hidden by the banner. So I don't really want to do this. Just showing you we could have multiple components. I'll just put that back. We're not going to use that app component at all. We're just going to work with our app component. So let's leave it here. So we haven't really written any code. We've really just used the CLI. And we've changed the startup component. So where are we going with this? Well, we're going to work with this component when we come back. First, we want to get it to display an artist. And then later, we want to be able to display a list of artists and also implement a form with two-way data binding. So when we click on one artist, it will populate the form. And when we change the form, it will automatically update the list in real time. So we're going to accomplish all of that with our app today. We're not working with the back end of the database. We're just sort of focusing on the Angular mechanics. Okay, it's 11:57. We need to take a break. I will create a repository and upload this to a new repository for today. And then I'm going to go stretch my legs. We'll be back in 10 minutes.